The morning air was sharp, carrying with it the smell of steel and engine oil, the heartbeat of a military base waking to another day. Trucks rumbled across the yard, boots struck the ground in perfect rhythm, and orders echoed from drill instructors as soldiers moved like pieces of a living machine. This was Fort Anderson, a sprawling United States Army base just outside Atlanta, Georgia. For most, it was a place of routine, discipline, and brotherhood. But on that day, something unexpected happened. Through the gates, a woman stepped inside. Her uniform was crisp, her posture unshakable, and her presence quiet yet commanding. She carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who had walked through fire before and refused to be bent by the flames. Her name was Colonel Maya Johnson. To anyone who didn't know her, she appeared as just another officer reporting for duty. But the truth was far more than that. Behind her lay years of sacrifice, deployments in war zones, nights spent leading troops through chaos, and scars both seen and unseen. She had risen higher than most ever dared to dream, breaking barriers that had held others back for generations. But none of that was visible to the soldiers who first laid eyes on her. A group of young men leaned casually against a Humvee near the training yard. Their laughter carried across the pavement, sharp and careless. They noticed her immediately, the way her uniform hugged her frame, the tattoo peeking just slightly from beneath her sleeve, the rich tone of her skin catching the morning sun. One of them nudged the other with a grin. "Look at that. Didn't know we had visitors from a fashion show today." The others chuckled. "Or maybe she's lost. Don't think I've seen her around here before." Another voice chimed in, laced with mockery. "Bet she won't last a week here. This base eats people alive." Then the whispers grew darker. They laughed at her tattoo. They laughed at her skin, their words dropping like stones meant to wound. The kind of ridicule that revealed more about their ignorance than it ever could about her worth. But Maya kept walking. Her steps were steady, her gaze forward. She had heard worse before. Much worse. And she knew, the higher one climbed, the louder the laughter of those who feared change. Still, the sting was there. Beneath her composed exterior, she could feel the weight of every eye on her. She was no stranger to it. In rooms filled with men who didn't look like her, she had stood alone many times. In war zones, she had been underestimated until she proved herself again and again. But this was supposed to be different. This was home soil. This was her own army. She paused briefly, her hand adjusting the strap of her duffel bag. For a fleeting second, the voices of her grandmother echoed in her mind, the same words that had carried her through childhood. "Hold your head high, Maya. They may not see your worth at first, but never let them forget it once they do." The laughter behind her continued, echoing through the yard. Some soldiers turned their heads away in discomfort, not brave enough to intervene, but not cruel enough to join in. It was the silence of bystanders, the kind that cut almost as deep as the insults themselves. What those men didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she wasn't just another officer. She was their superior. Their leader. Their colonel. And within minutes, the truth would arrive like a thunderclap that would silence their laughter and etch this day into their memories forever. That was the morning Colonel Maya Johnson walked into Fort Anderson. That was the morning the soldiers laughed. And that was the morning their world would change. The sun climbed higher above Fort Anderson, casting long shadows across the parade ground. Training drills continued as though nothing unusual had happened, yet the air carried a tension, subtle but undeniable. The laughter from earlier had already spread, carried by whispers between soldiers who hadn't been there but wanted to know what the fuss was about. Colonel Maya Johnson walked steadily through it all, her boots striking against the pavement with the rhythm of certainty. On the outside, she remained calm. On the inside, however, she knew the storm was already building. Prejudice rarely ended with a single joke, it spread, feeding on silence, growing bolder with each unchecked word. She entered the administration wing to report her arrival. The clerk on duty barely lifted his head until his eyes caught the insignia on her shoulder. His posture snapped straight, his pen nearly slipping from his fingers. "Colonel, welcome to Fort Anderson," he stammered, suddenly aware of the authority standing in front of him. Maya gave a polite nod and continued with the paperwork, but beyond the walls of that office, the whispers multiplied. Soldiers exchanged smirks and muttered comments. The story of "the new black lady with the tattoo" traveled faster than truth ever could. Some repeated it with ridicule, others with curiosity, but each retelling added another layer of distortion. It didn't take long for those whispers to reach the ears of men who knew better. At that very moment, inside the command headquarters, General Robert Hayes was reviewing training schedules when a knock came at his door. A young lieutenant entered, his face hesitant, his words careful. "Sir, I think you should know, there's been some behavior among the men on the parade ground this morning. A woman, an officer, arrived, and, well, they were laughing at her. Loudly. It was disrespectful." General Hayes set his pen down slowly. His eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. He was a man carved from decades of service, his reputation as unyielding as the steel fences surrounding the base. To him, respect wasn't optional. It was the foundation of the army. "Who?" His voice was low, steady, and dangerous. I didn't catch her name, sir. But, she's new here. Tall, confident. Black woman, colonel's insignia." The silence that followed was heavy. General Hayes leaned back in his chair, processing the lieutenant's words. He had reviewed the transfer orders just a week earlier. He knew exactly who it was. Colonel Maya Johnson. A soldier who had built her reputation in the field, decorated for her leadership under fire. He remembered the files well, reports of courage, of brilliance, of resilience. And now, his men had laughed at her. The general rose to his feet. His chair scraped back with finality. Without another word, he strode out of his office, his boots striking the floor like rolling thunder. Word spread quickly through the hallways. Soldiers stiffened at the sight of him, conversations died mid-sentence. By the time he stepped into the open air of the yard, eyes were already turning, following his march. The same group of soldiers who had laughed earlier caught sight of him. Their smugness evaporated in an instant. Straightening, they scrambled into formation, spines rigid, arms snapping to their sides. "General on deck," one of them barked, though his voice trembled. The men froze in sharp salutes, their faces pale with sudden dread. The laughter that had once filled the yard now seemed like a memory from another world. But General Hayes did not look at them. Not yet. His eyes were locked forward, searching past their rigid frames. Past the nervous salutes. Past the fear that hung in the air. And then he saw her. Colonel Johnson. Standing tall, unbothered, her hands folded neatly behind her back as though none of it had touched her. Her presence radiated calm, but her silence spoke volumes. The general's stride quickened. The soldiers' arms trembled as they held their salute, waiting for his fury. They expected him to turn on them, to unleash a storm that would break them where they stood. Instead, he passed them without a glance. The world seemed to slow. His boots struck the pavement until he reached her. Then, in front of the entire yard, General Robert Hayes came to a halt, straightened his back. And saluted her. The silence that followed was absolute. 100 pairs of eyes widened, breaths caught in throats. The soldiers who had mocked her only moments ago felt their stomachs twist into knots. Their arrogance drained away, replaced by a cold realization. They had laughed at a colonel. They had mocked their superior. Worse, they had disrespected someone their own commander had chosen to honor with the highest respect a soldier can give. The general's hand fell back to his side, but his eyes burned like fire as he finally turned toward the guilty men. His face flushed red, his jaw set like iron. And in that moment, they knew. Their punishment was coming. And it would be severe. The yard at Fort Anderson was a living machine of motion and sound, until that moment. When General Hayes raised his hand in salute to Colonel Maya Johnson, everything stopped. Engines idling in the distance seemed to fade. Boots halted mid-step. Even the wind seemed to quiet, as if the world itself leaned closer to witness what had just unfolded. A general, the commander of the entire base, had given a salute first. Not demanded it. Not expected it. But offered it, directly, deliberately, with the kind of precision that spoke louder than words. Colonel Johnson returned the gesture with equal sharpness. Her hand rose smoothly, meeting his with the weight of her own history behind it. For her, saluting was second nature, an act drilled into her muscle memory long before she earned her first stripe. But in that moment, it carried something heavier: dignity, validation, unspoken strength. The men who had mocked her earlier stood frozen in their makeshift formation, salutes trembling as sweat rolled down their backs. They wanted to disappear, to shrink into the pavement beneath their boots. None of them had expected this. They hadn't expected the stranger they had laughed at to be their superior. They hadn't expected the commander himself to honor her in front of everyone. And they hadn't expected the sting of shame that now burned hotter than any punishment they had ever faced. General Hayes lowered his hand and stepped closer to Maya, his voice low but firm. "Colonel Johnson," he said, each syllable weighted with respect, "welcome to Fort Anderson." She nodded once. "Thank you, sir." No one else dared to breathe. The sound of their exchange felt louder than artillery fire. The soldiers who had jeered just minutes ago now stood like statues, realizing that they hadn't just mocked a fellow officer. They had mocked a colonel, someone far beyond their rank, someone who had already carved her name into the stones of military history while they were still finding their foot. General Hayes turned at last to face them. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes burned with fury. For a long moment, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was punishment in itself, a weight pressing down on their chests. Finally, his voice rang out across the yard, sharp and cutting. "Do you know who you just mocked? Do you even understand the disgrace you've brought upon yourselves and this base?" The men stood stiffly, jaws clenched, eyes forward. No one dared to answer. "Colonel Johnson," Hayes continued, gesturing toward her with deliberate emphasis, "has served this country with honor you cannot begin to comprehend. She has worn the uniform longer than some of you have been alive. She has bled for this flag. She has carried men out of fire who doubted her before they followed her. And you," his voice sharpened, slicing through the air, "you thought it was appropriate to laugh." Their throats tightened. A few blinked back the sting of tears, but none dared lower their gaze. Colonel Johnson stood still, her hands behind her back, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in their humiliation. Her silence was steady, almost merciful. She let the weight of truth do the work. Hayes took a step closer to the men, his shadow falling across them like a judgment. "I will not tolerate disrespect in my base. Not toward me. Not toward your fellow soldiers. And certainly not toward your superior officers. You've disgraced yourselves. And you will pay for it." The words landed like hammer blows. But before he dismissed them, Hayes turned once more toward Maya. His voice softened, not in weakness, but in reverence. "This base will know your name, Colonel. They will know your strength. And they will learn respect, if not through wisdom, then through consequence." Maya inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words but saying nothing. She didn't need to. Her very presence, her unbroken calm, was enough. When General Hayes finally dismissed the soldiers, their salutes faltered as they dropped their hands, relief mingled with dread. They knew what was coming. Extra duty. Endless drills. The kind of punishment that broke pride and rebuilt discipline. But none of it would weigh as heavily as the memory of that salute, the moment their laughter turned to silence, their arrogance to shame. They would never forget it. And neither would she. The parade ground emptied slowly, the echoes of boots fading until only silence remained. But for the soldiers who had mocked Colonel Maya Johnson, silence was not freedom. It was the heavy pause before the storm. Later that afternoon, they were summoned. Their names barked out by a sergeant whose eyes carried no sympathy, only steel. The group of them, 6 men in total, assembled nervously in the yard once more. The sun was lowering, shadows stretching long, and the air itself felt heavier, as if it knew what was coming. General Hayes stood before them, arms folded behind his back, his frame like an unmovable mountain. Beside him, Colonel Johnson stood in the same posture, her expression calm but unreadable. The men avoided her eyes, shame prickling their skin like fire. The general's voice was cold and sharp. "You disgraced this base. You disgraced yourselves. And you disgraced the uniform you wear. That is not something I overlook. You thought mockery was strength. You thought laughter at another's expense was brotherhood. But you were wrong." He let the silence hang, forcing their discomfort deeper. "Your punishment begins now." The hours that followed would etch themselves into their muscles and memories forever. They were sent to the training yard, stripped of excuses, stripped of pride, left only with sweat and grit. Push-ups until their arms shook violently. Sprints until their lungs felt like fire. Carrying sandbags until their shoulders screamed for relief. Each command barked by the sergeant echoed in their bones. Down. Up. Faster. You call yourselves soldiers? Prove it. There was no laughter now. Only pain. Only silence broken by ragged breathing and the thud of bodies collapsing against the ground. And through it all, Colonel Johnson watched. Not with cruelty, not with satisfaction, but with measured resolve. She knew punishment wasn't only about discipline, it was about transformation. Sometimes respect had to be forged in fire. Hours turned into the deep orange of evening. The soldiers dragged themselves through the drills, their uniforms stained with sweat and dust. Their pride had been broken, ground down to nothing. But beneath the exhaustion, something new was stirring. A seed of humility. The first spark of respect. When General Hayes finally called an end, the men collapsed to their knees, chests heaving, bodies trembling. He stood over them, voice steady, firm, unyielding. "This punishment is not cruelty. It is a lesson. The uniform you wear demands honor. The people beside you, no matter their rank, no matter their skin, no matter their story, demand your respect. And if you cannot give it willingly, you will learn to give it through discipline." He let the words settle like stone. Then, with a sharp glance toward Colonel Johnson, he added, "You will not address her as, that woman. You will not address her as, lady. You will address her by her title, Colonel Johnson. And you will remember it." The men nodded weakly, voices hoarse but unified as they answered, "Yes, sir." For the first time, one of them dared to look at her. His chest still heaved from exertion, his pride shattered, but in his eyes was something different now, not arrogance, not disdain, but the beginning of recognition. Colonel Johnson met his gaze briefly, then turned away. She hadn't come here to win their approval. She had come here to serve, to lead, to carry the weight of command. Respect would come, or it wouldn't. Either way, she would continue to stand. As the soldiers stumbled back to their quarters that night, bodies aching, spirits heavy, none of them could sleep. Their punishment wasn't just physical, it lived in their minds. They replayed the image over and over again, the general saluting her, the colonel standing tall, their own foolish laughter echoing back at them like a haunting. They had been humbled. And though they didn't know it yet, this was the beginning of something greater, something that would bind them to her in ways they could never have imagined. The days that followed felt different at Fort Anderson. The humiliation of punishment lingered in the air, an invisible weight pressing down on the 6 soldiers who had mocked Colonel Maya Johnson. Their bodies still ached from the grueling drills, their pride still smarted from the general's words. And everywhere they went, eyes followed them. But what struck them most wasn't the whispers of their fellow soldiers. It was her. Colonel Johnson. She moved through the base with quiet authority, never needing to raise her voice, never demanding attention, yet commanding it all the same. She was everywhere, in the training yard at dawn, jogging with flawless rhythm, in the mess hall at noon, eating simply, her presence dignified but approachable, in the strategy room at night, her mind sharp and unyielding as she studied maps and orders. The soldiers couldn't escape her, but more than that, they began to notice her. One morning, they watched her stop during a jog to help a younger recruit who had fallen behind, adjusting his pace until the boy found his strength again. Another day, they saw her in the motor pool, sleeves rolled up, hands greasy as she worked alongside mechanics to repair a stalled vehicle. She didn't act above the tasks. She didn't hold herself apart. Respect, they began to realize, wasn't something she demanded. It was something she embodied. Still, shame clung to them. Every time their eyes met hers, they remembered their laughter, their words, the sting of their ignorance. And yet, she never spoke of it. She never mentioned the incident, never looked at them with contempt. Her silence was heavier than any rebuke. It gave them room to reflect, to confront themselves. It was during a late afternoon drill that one of them, Private Daniels, first began to shift. His squad had been ordered through an obstacle course, and halfway through, his foot caught on the rope wall. He dangled awkwardly, struggling, his face red with frustration. The other men snickered under their breath, but then, Colonel Johnson appeared. "Don't fight the rope, Daniels," she called, her tone even, instructional. "Work with it. Use your legs, push upward. Trust your momentum." Her words weren't mocking, weren't condescending. They were guidance. And when he finally reached the top, gasping for air, she gave a simple nod. No applause, no dramatics. Just acknowledgement. But to Daniels, that nod carried more weight than anything he'd felt in weeks. Slowly, the others began to notice it too. The way she remembered names after hearing them once. The way she listened carefully when soldiers spoke, even the lowest-ranking privates. The way her discipline was never rooted in ego but in fairness. One evening in the mess hall, as the 6 sat together in silence, another soldier leaned toward them and whispered, "You don't know how lucky you are. I heard she pulled 3 men out of an ambush in Kandahar. Went back under fire when everyone else thought it was over. She doesn't just wear the rank. She's lived it." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Stories of her reputation trickled through the base, rumors of valor, tales of sacrifice. And each story added another stone to the monument of respect rising quietly in their hearts. But the greatest lesson came in her restraint. She never reminded them of their mistake. She never held it over their heads. She simply showed up, every day, proving herself again and again without needing to say a word. That silence gave them no shield to hide behind. It forced them to wrestle with their guilt, to seek redemption not for her forgiveness, but for their own honor. Day by day, layer by layer, their perception shifted. She was no longer the black lady. She was no longer the woman with the tattoo. She was their colonel. And though they hadn't yet spoken the words aloud, deep down, they began to want something they never expected. Her respect in return. Respect, when spoken, could be shallow. But respect, when proven in fire, became unshakable. The trial came sooner than anyone expected. It was a sweltering afternoon when the alarm sounded. A piercing siren cut through the air, scattering conversations and freezing footsteps. Soldiers dropped their trays in the mess hall, sprinted from the barracks, boots hammering the pavement in unison. The call came down swift and clear. Disaster relief. A nearby town had been struck by chaos. A chain of violent storms had torn through the region, ripping roofs from houses, toppling power lines, flooding streets. Civilians were trapped, panicked, and in desperate need of help. Fort Anderson had been mobilized. Every available hand was needed. Colonel Maya Johnson was among the first to move. She issued orders with crisp clarity, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Trucks were loaded with supplies. Medics gathered their kits. Engineers prepared equipment for rescue. In less than 20 minutes, the base transformed from routine order to full deployment. The 6 soldiers who once mocked her found themselves in her squad. Fate, or perhaps deliberate design by General Hayes, had placed them under her command. They said nothing, only exchanged glances heavy with unease. The convoy roared out of the gates, tires throwing dust into the sky. And when they reached the town, the scene was chaos. Streets were rivers of mud. Families clung to rooftops. Children cried in the arms of frantic parents. It was here that Maya's true strength unfolded. She leapt from the truck and took command instantly. "You, secure that power line before someone steps in the water. Medics, set up triage near the school. Daniels, Carter, Lopez, come with me. We're getting those people off the roof." Her tone was sharp, but her focus was on the mission. There was no panic in her movements, no hesitation in her voice. She moved as though she had lived this moment 100 times before. The men followed, driven not by fear of punishment now, but by the force of her confidence. Daniel scrambled up the side of a crumbling porch under her direction, reaching for a terrified boy trapped on the roof. Carter waded through waist-high water to steady a woman whose legs had given out. Lopez carried supplies where they were needed most. Maya was everywhere, one moment directing a truck to higher ground, the next lifting debris with her own hands to free an elderly man. Sweat drenched her uniform, mud caked her boots, but she never stopped. She gave no orders she would not carry out herself. At one point, a weakened structure began to collapse. A mother screamed as part of her home buckled with her daughter still inside. Without hesitation, Maya sprinted forward, shoving aside the men who tried to stop her. She disappeared into the falling frame. For a breathless moment, everyone froze. Then she emerged again, carrying the child in her arms, coughing from the smoke, her sleeves torn but her grip unshaken. The soldiers who had once laughed at her stood stunned, their disbelief crumbling into awe. By nightfall, the storm's aftermath had quieted. Dozens of civilians had been saved. Supplies distributed. Order restored. And when the convoy finally returned to Fort Anderson, the exhausted soldiers collapsed into their bunks, too drained to speak. But none of them could sleep. The image replayed in their minds, Colonel Johnson wading through floodwaters, climbing into collapsing buildings, carrying lives in her arms without a flicker of hesitation. She hadn't just commanded them, she had shown them what leadership meant. For the first time, their respect wasn't born of rank, or fear, or duty. It was born of truth. She was their colonel. And she had earned their loyalty in fire. Change in the military rarely comes quickly. Attitudes can be stubborn, pride difficult to break, habits hard to unlearn. Yet sometimes, all it takes is one undeniable truth, one trial by fire, to turn everything upside down. For the 6 soldiers who had laughed at Colonel Maya Johnson, that truth had arrived in the storm. In the days that followed, they carried themselves differently. The smirks were gone, the careless jokes vanished. Where once they had whispered behind her back, now they straightened when she entered a room. Their eyes no longer avoided hers, but sought them, not with arrogance, but with something closer to respect. It began subtly. Daniels, who had been the loudest in mocking her, was the first to break the silence. One morning, as she inspected the barracks, he spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" Maya nodded. I was wrong, he admitted. His words seemed to weigh heavily on his tongue, as if dragged out from the depths of his pride. About you. About everything. I judged without knowing. And I want you to know, it won't happen again. She studied him for a long moment. Then, with a simple nod, she replied, prove it. No lecture. No gloating. Just a challenge. Daniel swallowed and nodded firmly. From that day on, he worked harder than anyone else. Whether it was drills, duties, or assignments, he pushed himself to exhaustion, as though trying to erase the memory of his disrespect through sweat. The others followed in their own ways. Carter began volunteering for extra duties. Lopez asked questions during training, eager to learn from her experience. Even the quietest among them, Private Simmons, started shadowing her steps, listening closely to her every word. But it wasn't only their behavior that changed. It was their hearts. They began to notice her humanity, not just her rank. The way she carried a worn photograph of her grandmother in her breast pocket. The way she paused before meals to whisper a prayer under her breath. The way she encouraged a struggling recruit with the same patience she once gave to them. Slowly, the distance between them and her began to close. One evening, after a long day of drills, they found themselves in the mess hall together. Normally, she sat apart, quietly finishing her meal. But that night, Daniels pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Carter followed, then Lopez, then the others. The table was silent at first, awkward with unspoken memories. Then Lopez cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, that day in the storm. You went into that building when it was collapsing. Why? You could have ordered one of us. You could have stayed safe. Maya looked at him evenly. Because leadership means taking the first step. Never ask of your men what you aren't willing to do yourself. If I want you to risk your lives, I must be ready to risk mine first. The words settled over them, heavy and profound. None of them spoke for a long time. But something unbreakable was forged at that table, a bond not of fear, not of punishment, but of shared respect. From then on, they weren't just soldiers under her command. They became her unit. Her shadow. Her proof that even the hardest hearts could change. In training exercises, they gave everything, because they no longer wanted to avoid her anger, they wanted to earn her approval. In the field, they carried her lessons with them, moving with sharper precision, stronger unity. And in the quiet moments, when laughter once mocked, it now carried respect. They had mocked her once. They would never do so again. Now, if anyone else dared, they would be the first to silence it. Colonel Maya Johnson hadn't just won their obedience. She had won their loyalty. And in that transformation, she had gained something rarer still. Their trust. The weeks rolled into months, and with them came the quiet transformation of Fort Anderson. Where once there had been whispers of mockery, now there were whispers of admiration. Where laughter had carried cruelty, it now carried pride. And at the center of it all stood Colonel Maya Johnson. She never sought recognition, never demanded praise. She carried herself with the same calm certainty she had walked in with on that first day. But everyone noticed the change. Her presence no longer stirred discomfort, it inspired respect. The 6 soldiers who had once mocked her became the most telling proof of that change. They were different men now. Their discipline sharper, their performance stronger, their camaraderie deeper. Others on the base noticed it too. Some even began calling them the Colonel's 6, not as mockery, but as a mark of pride. During field exercises, the 6 worked with unmatched unity. They anticipated her commands before she gave them. They pushed harder than anyone else, unwilling to disappoint her. And when new recruits arrived at Fort Anderson, the 6 were often the first to pull them aside, their voices firm but fair. Listen. You show respect here. Especially to her. Don't make the mistake we made. It was a legacy of humility, passed down not through punishment, but through transformation. One late autumn afternoon, the entire base gathered for a ceremony. The air was crisp, the American flag rippling high above, its fabric catching the light of the sinking sun. Soldiers stood in formation, boots aligned, eyes forward. General Hayes addressed them, his voice carrying across the yard. Today, we honor the men and women who have carried this base forward. Who have proven that strength is not in arrogance, but in service. Not in pride, but in sacrifice. Then he turned, gesturing toward Maya. And today, we honor Colonel Johnson. A leader who has shown us that respect is not granted by rank alone, it is earned through character, through courage, through the example we set for others. The applause that followed was thunderous. Maya stood tall, her hands behind her back, her expression calm. But within her chest, she felt the quiet weight of the moment. She hadn't come here for recognition. She hadn't come here to be applauded. She had come here to lead, to serve, to carry on the legacy of those who came before her, her grandmother, her ancestors, all those who had been laughed at, doubted, overlooked, but who never stopped standing tall. As the ceremony ended, she caught sight of the 6 men standing in formation, their heads held high. Their eyes met hers, and though no words passed between them, she saw it clearly. Gratitude. Respect. Loyalty. They had once mocked her. Now, they would follow her anywhere. That night, as the base quieted and the stars spread across the sky, Colonel Maya Johnson stood alone for a moment at the edge of the yard. She breathed in the cool night air, her gaze lifting upward. This was more than just her story now. It was theirs. It was the story of transformation, of strength, of survival. A story of a woman who walked into a place as a stranger, endured laughter, and turned it into silence. Then respect. Then loyalty. At Fort Anderson, the lesson was never forgotten. Because respect, once truly earned, leaves a legacy that echoes long after the laughter fades.